Hi, everyone. In this lecture, we'll be talking about gender and sexuality. Specifically, we're going to be talking about masculinity, femininity, and sexuality. In this, we'll be talking first about the expectations of men and women in our society and what that means. We'll also be talking about the women's movement and sexual orientation in those conversations. So let's talk about expectations of men and women. We do live in a patriarchy. That is the nature of our society. Patriarchy is defined as a society in which men have distinct advantages over women. And for this reason, our society has very different expectations for men than they do women. Now, with that said, both men and women are harmed by patriarchy. Just because we're in a patriarchy doesn't mean that it doesn't impact men, but it hurts both men and women, but men and women are treated differently, and men tend to be treated a little bit better than women in this society. So first we'll address the expectations of men. To understand the expectations of men in our society, we have to talk about this phenomenon known as hegemonic masculinity, which is the culturally constructed concept of the quote-unquote perfect man, or what it means to be a man, right? This concept excludes other forms of masculinity. Thus, if you are not the perfect man, if you are not manly, then you are somehow inferior to these very manly men. Here we see three examples of hegemonic masculinity. We see Chuck Norris, very aggressive, gun kind of guy with his big old muscles, right? Then we see Don Draper, fictional character, mind you, but portraying a kind of masculinity from the mid-20th century with a suit and tie and but he is also very physically strong too, if you watch Mad Men. And then we see Tom Brady, who's another type of masculinity. Now, this doesn't say so much about Tom Brady specifically himself. Tom Brady is a real person as opposed to kind of the imaginary characters of Don Draper and the fiction of Chuck Norris. Even though Chuck Norris is actually a real person, there's still a certain fictional element of him. Tom Brady, football player, as a football player to a successful team, he is held up as a type of perfectly masculine individual, right? That other men are held up to, and that other men can't really achieve, right? But if you are not that kind of man, you are somehow held as being inferior to that perfect man. And hegemonic masculinity is often tied with this idea of toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity are behaviors that are socially acceptable when exhibited by men, but are actually physically or socially harmful to the rest of society. So hegemonic masculinity is often, but not always toxic, but it can be toxic, right? So this is an idea of social toxicity, which is it's tough to wrap your head around because we often tie the idea of toxic in being tied into biology, right? So toxins getting in your body and making your body do bad things. But in this sense, we're talking about a social toxicity, something that exists in your social world that can hurt you. Examples of toxic masculinity, which this is best defined through examples, are an old man who refuses to go to the doctor because he says, oh, I'm tough. Oh, I can handle my way through this. Well, if you don't go to the doctor when you're actually sick, that can lead you to getting pneumonia and dying, right? That's toxic for that individual. Or if you say, oh, it's just a mole, and then that turns into melanoma and you dying or getting very sick because of a type of preventable cancer. Or refusing to get a prostate exam when that becomes medically relevant for you as an individual because you're afraid of the procedure and it's seen as being unmasculine. Those are examples of toxic masculinity. Competitive drinking. Getting very drunk because that's a tough, manly thing to do. That is a dangerous behavior, and it's something that men are encouraged by our society to do more. It's seen as being more masculine than it is feminine, and that's definitely an example of toxic masculinity. Men getting in fights, right? Men are more likely, due to how we present ourselves in our society, to get into a physical fight than women are. That is an element of toxic masculinity. And the inability of men to form meaningful emotional relationships with other men, right? The whole no homo phenomena, right? The inability for grown fathers to hug their sons and tell them that they love them, right? So it's more just about than just physical danger. It's about the inability to have lasting, meaningful, intimate relationships in a emotional sense. Those are elements of toxic masculinity. Now, the question is often raised, is all masculinity toxic? No. Here's some examples of non-toxic masculinity, right? Mr. Rogers, chief and foremost example of non-toxic masculinity. There is nothing about Mr. Rogers that is inherently feminine, and he's a masculine character, right? He was for generations and still continues to be a father model for children who didn't really have father models. And he was also deeply emotional and really helpful in that way. Great example of non-toxic masculinity. Neil Patrick Harris. He is, well, yes, he is openly gay, and that is an element of non-toxic masculinity. The willingness to look at sexuality. That sexual identity is not necessarily tied in with non-toxic masculinity, but acceptance of sexuality is tied in with it. He has a certain coolness that is associated with his masculineness as well. So that is an example of non-toxic masculinity. Conan O'Brien, kind of a goofy guy, willing to challenge his own masculinity, but still a very masculine character in and of itself. Another great example of non-toxic masculinity. So these examples don't show the whole gamut of what it looks like to not be a toxic man, but they show and they give examples of it is possible to be a non-toxic man, which when we first begin these conversations is something that often comes up. Now let's talk about expectations of women in our society, because by virtue of living in a patriarchy, the pressure on women to be womanly or typical is far greater. Those pressures do exist on men, but they're more on women. So women are disadvantaged in institutional settings in our society. Women tend to do a disproportionate amount of housework still to this day. That is still a reality, even though most of us feel that women shouldn't be the only ones doing housework. Women still do a disproportionate amount. Women earn less on average than their male peers at work. That at one time was 70% in the 70s when women, weirdly, numerically, that's just how it happened. When women first were going into the workplace, they were earning 70% to their male peers. Now it's more along the lines of 75 or 80% to their male peers. So they're still earning less, but not quite less. And women are more likely to remain and live in poverty than men are. This has led to a situation known as the feminization of poverty, which is the economic trend showing that women are more likely than men to live in poverty. This is due in part to gendered gaps in wages, so the fact that women earn less than men. It's due to the fact that a higher proportion of single mothers exist compared to single fathers. So when a parent leaves a family in one way or another, it's more likely for the man to do that as opposed to a woman. It is also because that courts are more likely to give sole custody to the woman as opposed to the man. That is true. It's also due to the increasing cost of childcare. Childcare is really very expensive. It isn't super helpful to talk about how much it costs because prices vary from one place to another because of cost of living. But it is safe to say that good childcare costs as much as rent, right? I'm comfortable throwing out numbers. When my elder daughter was in daycare, my younger daughter isn't in daycare yet, but when she was in daycare, if she would have been in full time, it would have been about $1,200 a month. And at that time, I was making around $1,200 a month, right? And our mortgage was about $1,200 a month. So that ate up most of my income. That's wild. That's intense. And if you don't know about that and how much childcare costs, it can be mind blowing. The second shift is a term that describes unpaid housework and childcare often expected of a woman, even after she completes a day of paid labor outside of the home. So this is the work that is imposed on women that do have jobs that aren't stay-at-home parents. 7 out of 8 stay-at-home parents are women, by the way. And women often are expected to do all of the housework after they get home, or a vast majority of the housework after they get home. There is no way around the second shift. If you have people that work in your household, and if you have kids, there will be dishes that need to be done. There will be laundry that has to be done. There will be jobs associated with kids that have to be done. The only way to get through the second shift is to share it between both partners, regardless of what their sex actually is. Now, the way the patriarchy often lays this out is that women do most of it, but the only real way to get around it is to say, okay, you're going to do this job and I'm going to do this job. Even our language and our vocabulary tend to reflect hierarchical systems of gender. This can be easier to identify in other languages because we're not used to speaking that language maybe as our mother tongue. Even that term mother tongue, right? That's gendered. But we see it in Spanish, right? With some verbs, some nouns being male and some nouns being female, right? We have Latino, gender, Latina, female, right? And we see that in all kinds of languages. But we also see it in our English language. We see it in our curse words, right? A bitch, if you are, I'm going to get a little blue here for a second. A bitch, if you're female and you're called a bitch, you're nasty, you're mean, you're unacceptable in these ways. If you're male and you're called a bitch, it means you're weak. It means almost the opposite of what the female bitch is, right? Swear words relating to genitalia are inherently insulting. To be called a dick is a different thing than to be called a cunt, right? Right. Those are incredibly loaded words, aren't they? And those words, they have different emotional tied to it, right? It's not that big a deal to be called a dick, especially if you're a guy. If you're called a cunt, that's a big deal. That's an incredibly loadedness to it, right? And that's a reflection of our patriarchal society, that one kind of genitalia is so much more insulting to be called than another kind of genitalia. Let's talk about the women's movement. Women's movement, also known as feminism. Feminism is the belief in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes, and the social movements organized around that belief. In the United States, the history of the women's movement, aka feminism, can be divided into 3 historic waves. Feminism has a lot of weird baggage associated with it. That's why I sometimes do call it the women's movement, because when people are asked, oh, well, are you in support of the women's movement? People say, absolutely, or they could. When they talk about feminism, though, they go, oh, I don't know about feminism, right? Or I believe in the equality of men and women, but I don't believe in feminism. Well, that's what feminism is. But to really understand feminism, you should understand its three waves. First wave feminism was the earliest period of feminist activism, including the period from the mid-19th century until when women got the right to vote in 1920. Because of this, because of that tie with that one issue, first wave feminism is often called the suffrage movement. Women's suffrage being women getting the right to vote. Second wave feminism was the period of feminist activity during the 1960s and 70s and is often associated with issues women gaining equal access to employment and education. This second wave feminism was far more politically abrasive than first wave feminism. Second wave feminism, those activists did things such as bra burnings, did things such as drawing lines between male domination and women's liberation. So what happened there was often, given the era, people would say there's no such thing as a good man. There's not, like, every act of heterosexual sex is rape, things like that. Really extremist statements. But you have to understand that women, to break that mold of heavy gender oppression during that era, it was seen as being necessary to make those kinds of bold, intense statements, right? And some damage was done in the fabric of our society a little bit by that intensity, but there are also scholars, and I would tend to agree, that that kind of abrasiveness needed to be done to make people willing to accept that women could be in the workforce, to accept that women could go to college and things like that. So when people have really strange ideas that feminism is inherently bad and inherently nasty and whatever and breaks up families, it is partially because they have an outdated view of what second wave feminism did, and they don't know about third wave feminism. Now, relating to second wave feminism, there was a corresponding men's movement that developed called male liberationism that developed in the 1970s to discuss challenges of masculinity and what second wave feminism meant for men. Now, male liberationism, because feminism at that time was sometimes called female liberationism, male liberationism was pretty short-lived because it almost immediately broke into two camps. It broke into a camp known as the men's rights movement and the pro-feminist men's movement. So the men's rights movement was a group that feels that feminism created disadvantages for men. And within the men's rights movement of the 1970s, we saw what by modern standards are considered incredibly flimsy arguments. Men saying things like, well, if women are going to go to work, who's going to take care of these kids? And who's going to make my dinner? And how's the house stuff going to get done, right? Real basic things that are obvious to us in the modern era. Well, you need to do it then, dude. That was alien to men of that era, right? Now, it should be stated that in the modern era of the internet, this men's rights movement has kind of rejuvenated itself in issues of our era that possibly our children and grandchildren will go similarly. You need to deal with that on your own, buddy. Things surrounding how, especially men's rights movement, talk about how women are portrayed in video games and how men have a right to see women as sexual objects, and that men should be allowed to buy certain kinds of video games and behave in certain ways, and those sorts of things. That's what the modern men's rights movement does. But also these men's rights movements also talk about other adjacent issues. But the men's rights movement specifically, do not be mistaken, is specifically online anti-feminist. at its core. If you delve into it, as with any ideology, if you dig into it, before you really get involved with something, you need to see what they really believe, and you need to see the whole picture. And I'm going to make a blanket statement I'm pretty comfortable with. The men's rights movement as it exists today is anti-women. It really is. The pro-feminist men's movement is a group that feels that felt that sexism both harmed men and women. And the pro-feminist men's movement wanted to change society's ideas about gender, similar to second wave feminism. What the pro-feminist men's movement did then was said, you know what, I really see what you're doing, second wave feminism, but men are concerned with these issues too, right? And men want to be able to raise their children, and men want to be able to maybe cook once in a while. And men might want the opportunity to be a stay-at-home parent too, right? And that wasn't incompatible with second wave feminism. It just wasn't something that a lot of attention was paid to during that era of feminist theory. So thus, the pro-feminist men's movement combined with second wave feminism to create third wave feminism. Third wave feminism is the most recent period of feminist activity and focuses on issues of diversity and the variety of identities that women can possess. Women and men, from this perspective, have the right to be both masculine and feminine, as we addressed when we talked about the gender spectrum, right? So you can do gender however makes sense for you. That's the concept of third wave feminism. So thus, third wave feminism addresses those issues of the men's rights movement, addresses those, well, not of the men's rights movement, of the pro-feminist men's movement, of, well, yeah, men are allowed to take care of their kids. And yeah, men are allowed to, if they want to, wear pretty colors or wear a pretty dress, right? That's what men can be allowed to do too. But also, women can wear pants in the morning and swing on a rope, and that is that's a feminine thing that a woman can do. And also, a woman can wear a pretty dress too. Those are both acceptable things that Dora can do, that women can do. And it doesn't mean that in the morning when Dora's swinging on a rope that she's any less of a girl or a woman than when she's wearing a dress. That's all acceptable behavior. And that's what third wave feminism is really all about. One more thing on third wave feminism. And since third wave feminism was established in the 80s and 90s, almost immediately there were people starting to talk about a fourth wave of feminism, and every couple years someone comes up with their new version of what fourth wave feminism is. I have yet to be convinced that there has been a fourth wave of feminism. I could be wrong, but I don't think we've seen it yet. But, we probably will see fourth wave feminism. I just don't think it exists yet. Sexual orientation. So sexual orientation is the inclination to be heterosexual, attracted to the opposite sex, homosexual, attracted to the same sex, or bisexual, so attracted to either sex. This isn't a perfect definition I give you, but it's who you want to have sex with, right? There are more sexual orientations than heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual, but it's who you want to have sex with. Remember that sex is your biological condition. It's what your physical body looks like. Gender is your behavior. And now we add to that sexual orientation is who you want to have sex with. One of the better ways to understand sexual orientation is to understand the Enzi Scale, which is a sexual orientation on a continuum. Kinsey found in his studies in the 40s and 50s that there are people in society that are on a continuum, a spectrum of who they want to have sex with, which was a revolutionary finding for the 1950s. He found that men who have sex with men, he studied men first. He also did a subsequent study on women, though. Men who have sex with men sometimes only have sex with men. But sometimes men who have sex with men also have sex with women sometimes, as would be a 5, or sometimes they equally have sex with men and women. Sometimes they only have sex with women, right? And that this is a scale, and there are points between the scale. And a bisexual person, subsequent studies have found, is very rarely exclusively a 3. A bisexual person, if one identifies as bisexual, they might be a 2, they might be a 4, they might be a 1, they might be a 5. The spectrum of sexual behavior of an individual is more than just gay and straight. And that was a big finding for Kinsey. A lot of his other findings were found to be incorrect, but keep in mind, the first person that studies something often makes a lot of incorrect observations. Another thing Kinsey found is that sexual orientation may change over the life course. So many of us have heard stories of older people that leave their heterosexual spouse, for a same-sex partner. And then people often say, oh, well, he was gay the whole time, or she was gay the whole time. Not necessarily. According to Kinsey orientation theory, it could be that sometime during the marriage, their sexual orientation shifted. And so it is possible from this perspective then to be a gay person in your 20s, and then something happens, then by your 50s, you're straight, or you're bisexual, or whatever. Now, in our modern era, most of us are familiar with the term LGBT. If you're not, LGBT stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, so people attracted to both males and females, or transgender. And I'll talk more about what transgender means in a moment. But there are more letters, and this can be really confusing if you're not really educated on the stuff. So I'm giving you an opportunity to get educated right now. Intersex people, I, if you see I included on there. These are people born with combinations of both parts, and this can be due to a range of biological conditions. This could be due to genetic makeup. This could be due to the makeup of the chemicals in the womb of the birth mother. This could be due to any number of things that could happen to the body. Intersex people are about 0.5% of the population, so half of 1% of the population. So Columbus, Ohio, that I live in, that means that there are 5,000 intersex people approximately living in our city, which is there are a lot of intersex people, and they often are invisible. We often just don't see them for who they are. I do not use the term hermaphrodite to refer to intersex people. That is an archaic term, and it's considered an insulting term to intersex people. Asexual people, sometimes called aces, are not driven by sex. And this can be hard for non-asexual people to understand because so much of the psyche of the sexual person is about, well, I'm going to have sex. I need to have sex. I'm aroused, right? Well, that, to the best of people's understanding of, because it's not how asexual people are. Asexual people aren't driven by sex so much the way that sexual people are. Asexual people can even have romantic partners. Asexual people may take pleasure from having sex, actually. But the reality of the matter is that they don't have the same sex drive that sexual people do. Allies are heterosexual sympathizers and friends. In the modern era, I would hope, I am a very long ally and outspoken ally. I hope that most people in our society now consider themselves allies, but maybe they don't. But that's all that term is that there is a place for heterosexuals in the LGBT community, but there are discussions on what it means to be a good ally and all that too. Pansexual people are people who are attracted to the personality, not the body type of the individual. This can also be relatively difficult for us to understand as non-pansexual people, but that is the best way I have been told to put it, because I'm not pansexual. Queer can be used as a catch-all to refer to the entire community. You can refer to it as the queer community instead of the LGBT community. Or you could not use this word if you don't feel comfortable using the word. Because queer for a long time was a slur against the community, there are many people in the community that don't feel comfortable with this term. A good rule of thumb is if you don't feel comfortable using a term, especially if that term was once a slur, then maybe don't use it. Use other words. Questioning is a term that's used for people that are questioning their sexuality. So if someone's just not quite sure about their own sexuality, because Kinsey theory shows us that sexuality can shift over the life course. So according to that, there probably are multiple moments in all of our lives when we are questioning our sexuality. But this term is most frequently used to describe youth, young people who are questioning their sexuality. So that's where that Q comes from. Here are some commonly confused terms. A transgender person is someone who feels that their gender does not fit in with social norms imposed on them, more specifically social norms imposed of them regarding their sex and their gender. Transgender is not a sexual orientation, but a gender identity, right? So for example, a transgender woman, so this refers to a woman who is by gender a woman, but may have been born with male genitalia or in a male body, right? So they may or may not be transitioning from a male body into a female body. All transgender woman means is that you identify as being woman and you are in a male body or were once in a male body. Transgender people may be heterosexual, they may be bisexual, they may be homosexual, they may be pansexual, they may be asexual. It doesn't have to do with who they want to have sex with. It has to do with the relationship between their gender and their sex. A transsexual person has been defined in the past as a person who feels the need to seek some form of gender reassignment surgery or hormone replacement therapy or something like that. This term, transsexual, is becoming obsolete because of the overemphasis placed on the trans community on talking about basically genitals, right? The reason it's becoming obsolete is not because it's not important to talk about that transition, but because basically straight people have paid too much attention to it. And now it's seen in the trans community as basically none of your business what someone's genitals looks like on any given day, right? You wouldn't ask someone who isn't transgender, hey, what's happening with your testicles, right? But too many trans people have had to face that kind of thing. So that's why it's now seen as being kind of an insulting thing to talk about. Now, trans is the preferred term for transgender in our society. That was as of 2016. That was kind of that turning point. So if you want to talk about transgender people, it's probably better to use the word trans as opposed to transgender. The trans community and trans rights issues have changed so dramatically fast compared to other social movements. So it's okay to be a little confused about this stuff because it's new stuff. And if you're apprehensive about that, just know that all of society is learning and changing, right? And it's okay to be a little bit wrong as long as you're willing to change and learn from your behavior. Another thing that's often confused with transgender is transvestite. This is a person who enjoys wearing the clothing of the opposite sex. That's a different phenomena. It's a different thing. Interestingly, transvestite people are usually heterosexual men. Sometimes it's associated with sexuality and sex, like the act of sex. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just a guy that likes to sit around wearing women's clothing because that makes him feel comfortable. Here's some more terms regarding being trans. The transition is when a person chooses to change their physical parts. This can include hormones, it can include surgery, and it can include a social transition. So telling your mom, hey mom, I know you gave me the name Jenny, but I'm Jim now. That's part of that transition. And that can be tough too. Or it can be none of those things, right? A trans person can identify as being trans without doing any of those things, even though that's probably a little more typical for them to do some of those things. The transition can be very expensive, especially the surgeries can be very, very expensive, and in most places it's not covered by insurance. So it really is also a class issue. A poor trans person is less likely to be able to get the transition done than a more well-off trans person. In the trans community, sometimes these abbreviations are used. MTF can refer to a male-bodied person who is transitioning to being female-bodied. FTM can be used to refer to a female-bodied person transitioning to be male-bodied. Here are some more terms relating to sexual orientation. A non-binary person feels that their gender identity cannot be placed in either male or female categories. So they feel that they want to use maybe the term they instead of he or she, right? That's a big part of our conversations around pronouns being used and why we are moving to a society as not only introducing ourselves, but also saying something like, hi, my name's Jeremy. I use he, him pronoun. And that sounds weird and a little foreign to us now, but in 10, 15 years, that might be absolutely common. And in some parts of the country, it is now absolutely common. Cisgender refers to when an individual's gender identity matches the sex that they were born with. This term, cisgender, applies to most of us in society. If you're not trans, then you are cisgender or you're cis, right? This is not an insulting term. We need this term, though, because if we only have a term trans and then we have everyone else, then that implies that trans people are weird or different. And the term cisgender, consistent, right? That's where that comes from, consistent gender. Then we are able to talk about trans people and cis people in a way that doesn't stigmatize trans people. That's why we need that term. As with many things on the internet, the term cisgender or cis has been used as an insult a time or two, or a bunch. But that's not the intention of the term, and we should still keep using the term. And I think we've gotten to the point in our society where we can now use the term cisgender and not have it be used as an insult. It's, I'm a cisgender heterosexual male. That's who I am, right? And I have a different understanding of the world than people of different genders and different sexual identities, etc. None of this is intended to be insulting, but we have to talk about it so that we can be better people and be a better society. Okay, that is it for this lecture. And this is fascinating stuff, and I look forward to our conversations.